What's up, guys? We're back for another episode of Form Check Friday. Now, I know we missed another one. We're just terrible people. Unfortunately, it was a really busy week. We did a lot of filming to try and get things figured out to make a cool meet wrap-up video. I competed on Friday at CPU Nationals, and I did pretty well. So if you want, make sure to go check that video out if you haven't already. And I take off tomorrow morning to go to the Arnold, where I'm gonna do some more deadlifts. So hopefully we'll have some more cool footage from that, and I'll talk a little bit about it. We'll have a video up on that next week. But let's get into the checking of forms. Now, our first video comes from Stanislav, and he's got a couple complaints with his sumo deadlift shown here from the side. The biggest thing that he's mentioning is that he finds his shoulders roll forwards. And he said he's fixed a lot of stuff about his deadlift, but this is something that he just can't seem to nail down. So the biggest thing, obviously, that we need is we need those shoulders to stay in position. The biggest way that I've found to do that is to really think about, like I use the cue of pinching your armpits shut a lot, but basically what we want is depression of the shoulder blades. So we want to try to pull those shoulder blades down into the lats. And the other thing that goes hand in hand with this is when you're initiating your deadlift, Stanislav, we're seeing those hips come up, which is putting the hips up and increasing the amount over the bar that your shoulders are. So your torso ends up going in this way over top of the bar. So I want you to work on keeping the weight on your heels a little bit better as you initiate the deadlift. I want you to work on really trying to sink those shoulder blades down, not back, but down your back and into sort of, you think about pulling the shoulder blades into the lats. And then the last thing would be to try to not let those hips creep up as you initiate the movement. We definitely want to try to initiate the movement maintaining the same position that you set in your setup, because your setup position looks pretty good, but as soon as you start moving, we're losing some of that hip position. The hips are drifting up ever so slightly behind you, and that's causing some of these issues. So yeah, those are the cues that I would use, and I would try doing some pause deadlifts. Pausing right off the floor, because that's right where you see that loss in position, and I would work with that in your programming if you can, and that should hopefully help you make some improvements there. Now, our next submission comes from Eric Mills in the form of a meet video. So we're gonna look at all three of your lifts here, and we're gonna talk a little bit about them. So in your first squat, your opening squat, you've really bottomed out. So I think that was probably a little bit of nerves that caused you to squat much deeper than you needed to. But that looseness and the fact that you use that style of squat and have a little bit less control in the bottom is essentially what kind of undid you on your third attempt. So if we look at the opener here, you'll see we really kind of pancake into the bottom, lose a fair bit of tension, and that's one thing that I'd try to avoid to the extent that we see it in this opening attempt. Now, in the second attempt, you did a much better job of it. We didn't get quite as much chest fall, we didn't get quite as loose, but on the third attempt, we went back to that, got pretty loose. We saw the knees crash in. We lost hip position. So the biggest thing I would try to do is cue yourself to be a little bit more under control, a little bit more in constant tension as you're changing directions in the bottom of the squat, because that looseness is leading to a number of these faults manifesting. The other thing I would try to work on is with your squat, I would do maybe some pause squats or pin squats to get stronger in the bottom position, because that's where things are falling apart, is right out of that bottom position. So for you, I'd probably say pause squats. Now, the reason I would suggest those over pin squats is that it's a general looseness. It's not necessarily that the chest is just collapsing, which would make me lean more towards pin squats. But pause squats, a little bit tighter in the bottom, try to maintain better constant tension. Now, if we look at the bench presses, honestly, your bench press technique in terms of what your upper body's doing, your shoulder position, your bar path, all that stuff, very good. I just want to say a note about leg drive. If we look at your hip in relation to your knee and the height of both, one thing that generally helps people get a little bit better leg drive in their bench press is going to be to get the knee below the hip. And that's also going to contribute a little bit to the global extension through the hip, low back, mid back, upper back, to try to create that arch that puts us in a declined position, a little bit of a biomechanical advantage, et cetera, et cetera. So I would try to move the feet either wider or further back towards your body to try to get the knee a little bit lower than the hip to increase your leg drive on the bench press. Other than that, I really don't have much criticism, so we're just gonna move on. Now, the deadlift. Fairly round in the low and mid back. I've talked about this a number of times, but if you want to go from being a round back puller to a flat back puller, I strongly believe Mike T's approach, where you essentially need to break them into two different movements. If you're going to continue being a round back puller and you just want to be stronger and more consistent with it, I would work on pause deadlifts and probably some accommodating resistance. Is something that I've been working with some of my rounder back pullers, is using some accommodating resistance so that that top end is going to be challenged. And if you're smoother through that range of motion and you're better with your lockout, you're going to be rewarded as you get through the accommodating resistance. If you do it poorly, in terms of that last little bit of extension at the top, which is where most round back pullers start to kind of fall apart, is like knee up. If you do that poorly, the accommodating resistance is really going to kick you in the ass and cause you issues. So pause deadlifts and some accommodating resistance, whether it's bands or chains, I'd say 10 to 20% of 1 rep max, no more than that. Any less than 10%, you're really kind of creating a negligible effect as far as I'm concerned. That's totally anecdotal, but the other thing he mentioned here is that he's done some sumo deadlifts and that made his back feel a lot better, but he had a weird hitch at the top. Now, 9 times out of 10, that hitch at the top is a result of loss of back position off the floor. So I would have a similar approach. Do you want to be a flat back puller? Do you feel that the benefits outweigh the loss of strength from your current deadlift technique? If so, treat it as a totally separate movement. Start from the ground up, take your time, rebuild that whole pattern, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or, like I said, challenge the bottom position with pause deadlifts and challenge that lockout or that hitch. Try to make it not a hitch, obviously, and use some accommodating resistance. Hopefully that helps, Eric. Our next video here is from Eero, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. I'm just doing the best I can here. So Eero, he's noticing in his squat, he gets a little bit of a knee crash, and this is the sort of chest fall or chest forward pattern that I was talking about earlier that would make me lean towards pin squats. So obviously I'm gonna recommend that you use pin squats in your training. Focus a little bit more in terms of cueing. Focus a little bit more on keeping your lats active, keeping your shoulder blades pinned back together as well as depressed, and just creating a little bit more tension through that trunk and torso, not rushing out of the bottom position, keeping the quads engaged, so not allowing the knees to shoot backwards, knees over toes. All of these things, all of these cues will be useful if you can implement them. And as well, I wanted to make, like I said, the programming recommendation of using pin squats to try to fix some of those faults. Because specifically in the pin squat, if you use those cues properly, you're gonna pin squat really well. If you have the same deficiencies in your pin squats, you'll very quickly notice it because it's going to essentially punish you for doing that fault, for being, for moving in those faulty patterns. So a really good way to sort of reinforce those cues and help yourself with your squat pattern. Hopefully that helps. And our last video for today comes from Samdish. He says he's a fellow Canadian. This is a PR attempt. And there's a couple things going wrong here. First off, I want to sort of disclaimer my critique here by saying that yes, this is a PR attempt. There's probably more technical breakdown than you're normally gonna see in reps. And that also makes it a little bit hard for me to critique. So, advice for future submissions, try to give me something in that 75 to 85% range, even 90%, couple of reps. PR attempts can be hard to judge because sometimes things fall apart that don't normally fall apart there in training. and that's just the nature of PRs. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. If you watch my 375 deadlift, you'll notice my hips start to creep up a little bit, my shoulders start to creep forward a little bit. There are some technical faults with that lift that maybe wouldn't happen with your average working weight, but that was pretty close to a max attempt, so there's some trade-off. Anyways, let's talk a little bit about what's happening here in Sam Dish's deadlift. Obviously, we're losing a lot of position. So you see here, as Sam Dish initiates the lift, the knees are caving in, the back is rounding out. There's a number of things going wrong here. So upper back, lower back, pelvis, all out of position, which makes for a little bit of a janky lockout. So, number of cues: knees out, make sure that we maintain the knees at the same angle as the toes. We need to do a better job of holding and creating extension through the low and mid back specifically, as well as holding the shoulders in a bit of a better position in terms of, like I told Stanislav, keeping the shoulder blades locked down into the lats and maintaining integrity through the trunk. So a number of cues there. Programming wise, almost always going to recommend the pause deadlift, pausing just barely off the floor, because it looks like the initial 2 to 6 inches of the lift is where we're losing the most positioning. So if we can better cultivate good technique in those initial parts of the movement, it's going to lead to a lot better lift throughout. So hopefully that helps you, Sam Dish. Obviously, like I said, a PR attempt can be rather tricky to critique, but I hope that I hit the nail on the head there for you. And actually, I lied. That was not the last form check for today. The last form check for today comes from Tom. Now, Tom gave me a little bit of a write-up about his sumo deadlift, and he said that his biggest issue is that he's unable to get his hips into a good position. He feels that he's a very sort of hips high puller. He says in his conventional, his back's almost parallel to the ground. And let's see, he feels like it's a wide stance conventional, struggles with sitting back behind the bar, shoulders are always in front of the bar on heavier loads. If he tries to sit down lower or sit back, he always tips forward into this position. So the biggest thing that I'm seeing here is, number one, that it's very rushed. You're pulling into position and just going. As well, I feel like you could be pulling into a much better position. I think that the position that you're defaulting to is less than optimal. I feel that if you can get a little bit more upright, sit a little bit further down, and get yourself behind the bar, that's going to do a lot of good things. But that's probably not going to be something you're able to do with the weights that you're accustomed to working with. So I think the biggest thing here is, number one, you're not achieving a good starting position. So you're going to need to dial the weights back to use loads that are appropriate for creating a new technique, or for having sort of a major overhaul or large changes to your technique. So part of it's going to be the expectation of, okay, how much do I want to develop my technique, and how much strength am I willing to sacrifice in the name of that, at least in the initial phases of creating or cultivating a new technique. So if you want these things to be fixed, if you want to be able to address them, you're going to need to lower the weight on the bar. You're going to need to attack it from a very ground up, bottom up, start over kind of mentality, because the position that you're defaulting to and the position that you're comfortable in, the position that's ingrained, is just simply less than optimal. That's not to say that you can't get strong in this position should you choose or decide that that's the way that you want to proceed. Now, this is up to you, and this is where it's useful to have a coach to kind of weigh the pros and cons of these things. In my opinion, I would probably take the steps back needed and the steps necessary to fix the position. But again, the onus for that and that decision-making process lies on your shoulders. So that's kind of my 2 cents with that, and hopefully that gives you some insight into how I would approach it if I were your coach, and you can make an informed decision from that. That's it for today's Form Check Friday. We will be back on track with these, I promise. I don't have anything too crazy coming up. So we're gonna get some more of these out. We're up to December 4th or 5th right now. and it's March 1st as of the day of filming, so we are pretty far behind. We might be doubling up. We might be putting out a couple per week in the coming weeks to try to make up some ground. And as I guess sort of an actionable apology to you guys for missing a couple of these, because I know how well received these videos are and how much you guys appreciate this stuff. And it's something that we enjoy doing and it's fulfilling to do because we know it has a positive impact on our viewership. So anyways, that's enough of my blabbing today. Dylan and I are both getting hungry and we're gonna move on with our days. But thank you very much for tuning in. Like I mentioned earlier, if you haven't already, go check out the Nationals wrap-up video. Hopefully, around the time you guys see this, I'm in the process of deadlifting something really cool at the Arnold. And I'm gonna have 9 for 9. Adam Palmer, my man, is gonna be there filming some stuff for us, so we will not be lacking in that department. Stay tuned for the next Form Check Friday and the upcoming videos. We got some really cool, funny stuff coming up, and that's it. We'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks for your submissions. Bye-bye.